back to my presentation. Okay, so REST API, what is it? So when you start working with the API of Spire, one of the things to keep in mind is that as you learn the REST API or the API of Spire, you're learning what the REST API is. So this is a bigger picture in that when you understand and learn and know how to use the REST API in Spire, you now have learned how to use the REST API in general. So REST API, it stands for a representational state transfer. It is a software architecture for the World Wide Web, so for the web. It is web-based, and I'll briefly talk a little bit about using this in desktop application. And so I'll briefly talk about that. But mainly is that when you want to use the REST API, you want to do web development. And that can come in different forms as well. For example, mobile apps today, that's mainly, largely any mobile app there's some form of REST API in it. So REST API is like I said, an architectural standard. And when you learn this, you'll learn to develop for all kinds of systems. So I was previously showing two of them here. So Google, in just about anything that you can imagine, they provide REST API for accessing their services. So here we have Google service, and it allows you for accessing their map API web services. And this would be something like if you had an app or a web application, again, desktop application, there's some possibilities there as well using the REST API, and you want to embed let's say directions or just elevation or geocoding, geolocation. You wanted to embed some of that into your application so that essentially you wouldn't have to send users off to Google to do that kind of lookup. You can use their API web services, and then you can go and embed that into your application. Another one, the screen that you saw previously, this is a flight status tracking company. And when you go to airports and you see these big monitors where they display flight status and airport status and whatnot, this is essentially the company that provides that service. And their API is published. It's fully open. There's no authentication or nothing required. So that, let's say you wanted to develop a web application where you want to give your users the ability to check on flight status, and you may have something unique that you do with your application. And so again, you don't have to take them out, or they have to go and leave your application and check the flight status elsewhere and then come back. So you can embed this into your application. And this is a REST API as well. So that's important to understand here, that if you learn the Spire API, what you're really learning is you're learning the REST API. And once you understand it in Spire, once you develop for Spire, then you will start understanding that for just about anything. Facebook, Google, on any of their services, you can go and do REST API calls. Any major company today, they are using it in some form or another form. So that's something to keep in mind that as you learn, so that you're not just learning for Spire. So then Spire did not necessarily come up with their REST API. They essentially took a platform, and I'll briefly talk about it later on. They took a platform and just plugged it into their server component, and then published that, and now they have a published API. Now, that does not mean that Spire doesn't do anything behind the scene, because it still needs to interact with their application, with their logic and whatnot. And so we've been working with Spire a little bit, and I'm not sure if you guys heard that part before. I've been working with Spire actually for the last month. We've been delving in, using the REST API and giving them feedback, have put in some feature requests and certain things that weren't working that they've fixed for us. And so then there's already a big head start for all of you guys, and that if you want to start going, there's already a lot of things that we've covered with them and discussed, and so then it's easier for you guys to get going. The second very important thing here is network security. Now, this may sound like, where does network security come into all of this? It does largely. And network security, so when you're going to start developing for Spire, and let's say you are developing a web application, if you were developing, say, a desktop application, you were using the RESTful API to call the web service. So again, your desktop application would need to have an ability to call a web service, and it's just internally to the business. Then that, of course, would not require any ports or any network security, because if the application is just being used inside of the company, inside of the physical walls, then there is no network security considerations. But on the other hand, if you're developing for the so that applications will be able to access it on the outside, and this would be something like I'll talk a little bit later on what we are working on, but an app, so a mobile app, that's something we are working on. So a mobile app will go in the field and with a mobile device, and they will be able to want to access the data. And now a mobile app could be accessing it from anywhere, from a cell phone tower or from a Wi-Fi connection they're connected to. So this is where network security is very critical. And what happens here is you have to open ports on a firewall to allow to access it, and you have to also do SSL, like a security certificate. The REST API, their API from Spire, does come with a self-signed certificate, and you'll see later on. I will talk about that a little bit and show you guys what the difference is between a self-signed certificate versus a certificate you buy from an authority, such as GoDaddy, and there are tons of vendors out there. Well, back to the open port. So you do open up a port, and it's for Spire. It is the just go back here to the Spire. It's the port 100880. That's the port that you're going to be opening, so that your application can access the Spire API from the outside. Now, one thing to first keep in mind: we've been talking to Peter in the development team at Spire, and so far their API is not hardened to allow this type of access. So it's not made secure at this moment. So you should be very careful with this, that if you did plan anything. We currently have one of ours published to the web, but what we do, and this is critical, what we do is we limit that by IP address, so that if somebody wants to access it from outside, we have it whitelisted to only certain IP addresses. So that means that no one could ever access it or stumble upon it. That's a very critical component here in making sure your network is secure. And here, if you are not the provider, network support company for your company, and they do choose to host Spire inside, like, so again, not many customers will go to the cloud or anything like this for Spire, for smaller companies specifically. Here's where, if you're not the network provider, here's where you want to have a discussion with the IT provider, and hopefully you'll find someone reasonable to work with regarding opening ports and securing your network. Never do this on, say, the home Linksys router that a company may be using for their network security. You can open ports, but there is very little security behind that, or nothing. If the port is open, it's open. So you do need sophisticated network infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be expensive. So then, you have these switches from Cisco for small businesses, and generally I have found them to be very complicated. We use this solution here, Untangle. It's a very sophisticated firewall, very reasonably priced for small businesses, and it works really well to secure your network and do this type of stuff. So anyone interested, we can discuss this offline later on, but that's what we use, and again, very sophisticated and very secure. So that's network security. Very important to keep that in mind. So again, I mentioned briefly, it's web-based. You do your calls via the HTTP protocol for the Spire API or RESTful API. So the benefit here is that you don't need to know the application logic. And what I mean by application logic, so for most of you who've been developing for Business Vision for a long time, and now for Spire or even other applications, and you have, let me just double check on my chats again, see if, okay, yeah, everything's good. Okay, so you have interacted with the database directly. So one is you just read the database, and then you do your queries, and a lot of us probably learned this with Access, Microsoft Access, how to do this, or directly in the Pervasive Control Center, now in the Postgres SQL PG admin. So that's where we do the direct interaction with the database with queries, and then we can also do insert queries, and that is, many of you will have developed and done an insert query. And as you will know, that if you do an insert query and you want to update a customer record, a part of a customer record, and let's say an address, so you now have to develop this insert query and update two tables, the customer, the address, and it can go a lot more complicated. Let's say for those of us who've done order inserts into BV, so we are basically touching, I think, 4 tables by just inserting an order. So as you know, it gets complicated, and the biggest part is that you have to learn the application logic. If you don't understand the application logic, you're never going to really succeed in inserting it. So now here with the REST API, we have no need to know any application logic. Basically, the REST API is plugged in to Spire, and then that connection, that development, and interacting with the application logic is done by the developer, Spire in this case. So that is a big benefit. And again, this now becomes a standard, is that if you know the REST API here in Spire and how you develop and how you interact with the data through the API, you now have the benefit of knowing what to do in other applications that provide a REST API. I keep on saying RESTful API, so it's all the same, really. So here, what I will do, so briefly I'm going to talk about the, and I'll go back a little bit. I'll talk about the platform that they use, and I should have had this before in the presentation. Spire API is adopting this API. They're using this API, which is a REST API platform that they use and plug into their application. And then again, we interact with the API, and they do the between. So we don't have to again learn learn as much about the logic of the application. Still, you still will need to know some logic in the application, but considerably less, or much less than if you were interacting directly in the database. This is what they're using. And I was here 2 weeks ago on this page, and I don't know, I think it's a new development. It's an open source, so then of course open source developers sometimes take something and then they start developing. And there's already a lot more information than 2-3 weeks ago when I came here. What this was originally based off of, it's this one here, so it's very well documented already, but I'm not sure why they would have taken this one. And often it is an open source developer has an idea that they like to pursue, and then the one from the previous project, they didn't want to pursue that idea, and so then they go, and it's kind of like a split, and they go and say, okay, we'll take what you have currently, and then we'll go our own way and develop it. So this is what Spire is using. So then you won't find a lot of documentation with Spire as of yet, and I don't know how extensive they will document theirs. And the thing is, they don't need to document it very extensively. They just need to provide you some basic documentation, and then you come to this website here and you start using this information and reading up on it. So anyone interested in learning more about the Spire API specifically, then you want to come to these sources. If you're just interested in learning first more in general about the RESTful API, then use other sources. I mean, just do a search on Google, RESTful API, anything, courses, search for it, and you will find a lot of information on it. It's very popular, and a lot of YouTube videos, you name it, you'll find a lot of information. So this is what Spire is using as their platform, as their to plug it into the Spire application and database to communicate with it. And so again, no web base. So authentication methods. So for those of you who have already briefly interacted with that a little bit, have gone, and I will get into that in a little bit, there's authentication methods that you have to authenticate. So that would be the second layer of security when you would publish a database as a REST API and make it publicly open to a port and have it accessible from the outside. So authentication is the second security step. And as of right now, the Spire API only provides the auth. That's what it's called, auth basic, which means that you can access it by username and password. Many applications already today, they support the auth 2, and I believe it has officially been defined in release as a standard that you can use now. That's a very different standard than the password and username, it's in its own layer of technology or architecture and how you authenticate. So then some of you may have had experience where you're on Facebook. So I think pretty much anybody here has a Facebook account. When you're on Facebook and then all of a sudden you want to interact with some other application um, to link something to your Facebook account, or use, for example, use a when you go to a different web service. I've done that where where you can set up an account with them, or you can use your Facebook account to log into a different service. So for those of you who have done that and you have given that authorization on your Facebook to use another service with the same account, you've actually used the auth2. That's what's being used. So what happens with that, there's some token exchange between the two applications. And it's all behind the scene. Once developed and once set up, it's all behind the scene how these tokens get exchanged. And then you have the authorization between the two applications. So that will possibly come later on. I know I talked to Al a little bit about it, and he passed on the information to the developers. I don't know at what point that will come. That will come. So basically keep in mind that you can stick to the basic authentication for now. That's the only thing that's being supported. But the auth2, it's another layer of security that just makes it more secure with interacting between different applications, again, using the REST API. Briefly, I talked about it a little bit. Using the REST API with desktop application, is it possible? Yes, probably not going to be very common, and that is going away. I don't know. My prediction is that 10, 15 years from now, we won't see much for desktop applications, but who knows? They may still be around for a very long time. So if you do desktop application development for Spire, yes, you could use it, but you still have to learn the standard, use a standard the web service, and then your application has to have the ability to call a web service if you want to interact through the Spire API. So for those of you who see this and say, oh, well, that's too complicated, I don't want to learn all of this, it takes me too long, you may just want to stick to the traditional method to talk to the database directly instead of using the REST API. Or if you're not ready to get going today, slowly learn the REST API and you will start interacting with it. So I already explained the REST API, the platform that Spire is using. So it's the Flask API. Again, go to that website. In a lot of documentation there that you can read up on and learn how to use it. Next, how does the REST API work? What is it? So when you'll read and you learn about this, you'll learn that the REST API, it's verbs. It's actually verbs and how you interact with it. And the verbs are get, post, put, delete. So those are the verbs. And next, when you interact with it, basically there's a couple components to it, and you need the URI, the media type, the HTTP verbs, which are the get, post, put, delete, and links to references and links to resources. One word missed there. Links to resources. And what I'm going to do is I'm now actually going to go specifically into the technicality of it and show you a little bit how that all works. So for those of you who have already looked around in the Spire API, you'll already have seen some of this. So when it originally was published, before it was officially released in version 1.2, this is the only thing I believe that that Al sent us just to get started. So you see some very basic documentation, but again, I don't think that anyone interested in developing, you should not expect Spire to provide a lot of documentation. I'm sure they'll provide some sample code and things that you can do, but there is a lot of information there. So just waiting for Spire to release more documentations and then getting going, it's not needed. So you will find a lot of information out there. Again, videos, YouTube videos, just about anything. Just do a search for REST API or RESTful API and you will stumble across a lot of information. So Spire has provided a little bit, and you'll find some information. So here's just some introduction. So first, it talks about versioning and how they plan on maintaining the version. So this would be important that if they do come up with a new version, and it's very likely where, say, they would introduce authentication that 2 with the token exchange, then they would go to the next version. So anytime they would introduce a major component, new component, or something else into the API. So then they would go to the next version. So here, this is a good place to just read what they intend on doing. So this explains that they will start version 1, 2, and then how they would keep on supporting the versions after updating them. So the versioning for the Spire API will be very specific. That's not going to be related to exactly to what the version is of the Spire application. So here it will be version 1, 2, 3. And so the API will have its own versioning. Here, it talks about SSL. So I briefly mentioned it before. So it's accessible by the browser, and therefore you definitely want to use SSL. Well, it wouldn't even work without it. It does not work without it. So that's a good thing in that you cannot develop something and all of a sudden find you did it by exchanging information that you leaked some information. So SSL, it's just like you interacting with your bank. The information is encrypted when you talk between your application and the REST API endpoints. Here just talks about the roots. So here we're down to the verbs and get, post, put, and delete. Now I'm going to get into a specific example for just briefly testing here a little bit. Today I'm mainly going to be using the Spire interface itself, like the web interface itself, to do a little bit of updating and working with the application to show you how that works. And I'll briefly show you, for those more technically inclined people, I'll briefly show you one file, an example that we worked on. And keep in mind, for those of you on the call who are not technical, who just want to see the possibilities, I think this should give you a lot of information to say, oh, these are the possibilities. So it's more like you may have a customer and you may go to them, they may ask you, well, can we integrate, let's say they were asking you, can we somehow make Google Maps talk to our application, or so that we can go from our application? That would be a very simple example. So if we can go from our application and click on a link that would take us to a Google map, let's say you did some form of development, that would be done through the REST API. So let's say your customer asks you, we do this very often, and we simply want a link here where we can go and call a Google map versus us having to go and separately enter the address and so forth. That would be a simple example of. And so when a customer would ask you that and say, oh yeah, the possibilities are all there. It has a really good API, so the possibilities are there for you for you to interact. And then if you're not a developer, well, then you'd go and find yourself someone who can develop this for you. So I'm briefly going to show. So here you see the verbs. Now, for those of you who've been here and played around a little bit, you have already seen this. The endpoint for seeing the companies is starting, that is basically the URL that I have here. I briefly talked before about publishing the URL to the World Wide Web to open it up. This one actually is. This is published to the World Wide Web. You could go and access this right now. We do restrict it by IP address, so you couldn't. Basically what it means that if this was published to the web and this was open, so anybody could come here from anywhere in the world and they could go and pull this up and they could see the companies. As soon as you get beyond this point where the companies are listed, then you do require authentication, and it's the same password, a user and the same password that you would have set up in Spire that would allow you this. So this is the first point where you come and access it, and this is now where you see your companies. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go into the Inspire Health database. So now here I'm seeing the next level of endpoints. These are technically not the endpoints, but this is the next level where you can start seeing the resources that you can interact with. And this goes back to what I was saying here, is that you need the URI, which is the URL, media type, that's the language that you're going to use in interacting with the REST API, and then the verbs and link references. So right now, here, I'm at the link references. So these are my references. And the next part is, I was going to put here, links to the endpoints, to the resources. So that's what I'm seeing here. So here I'm seeing my references. Now I can go and click on any of these references and go inside of that reference. So let's go to currencies. And you'll see here that as you may have, if you've read the emails that Al sent on this and then was saying, so he mentioned that to date, they only allow get on everything. Get, that's the verb. That means you're just going and getting and reading the information. That would be probably the most popular one, in that if you develop something and all you're doing, you're just grabbing information, just like doing a query against the database, and you're grabbing information from Spire to interact with your application, then you would just do a get. And that's a very simple one. So if you want to learn, you want to start working with it, do a get on any of the resources, and then you start seeing how that all works and what it all does. So Al did mention that so far they only have the, I believe, the customers, the sales orders, and the inventory, where you can do all 4 verbs. You can get, put, delete, which one? Lost my train of thought. So you can do all those verbs. So here you can see that I'm in my currency list, and there's just a get. That's all there is. So here I see my currency list. And this here, one of the things to keep in mind, it's in JSON format. That's the, and what's referred to here as the media type. Media type is what you're going to use. So you're going to, depending on what language you're going to use, JSON is the one that I would suggest that you learn. You can also use XML while you interact with this. So that's another one that's a little easier to understand and read. And briefly, now that I'm talking about XML, I'll show you one page here. This is Magento. So we develop Magento and Integrate that have our components are linked to Spire for Magento. This is a Magento endpoint REST API. Again, as I mentioned before, just about any application today has that option. This is an endpoint, and this is an XML, as you can see here. So it looks a little bit more readable when you look at XML, and I'm sure most of you developers or you will have an understanding of what XML does and how you can take XML data and convert that into readable data for an end user. So I'm sure you've come across this. So the REST API works with different media types, XML, JSON. These 2 are probably the most popular. But if you really want to learn and get into it, then make sure you learn how to do this in JSON as you develop. That's the best one. So inside of the application Inspire here, it's all JSON. So now here, as you can see, I came to a customer endpoint. And an endpoint is the end of whatever it is that gives you the information. So I can, for example, I'm here on 214. I just want to remember that, so I can change. So I can, for example, go to all of my customers. Now I'm listing all of my customers here. Well, by default, it gives you a count of 10, a limit of 10. And you can always change that. In your code, you could say, well, you want a limit of 100 or whatever limit of records you want to turn when you do something. So here, this is not the endpoint. This is just a reference. And it just references briefly some information about each customer. But then here where you see self, that means that if I click on here, it's the endpoint for this customer record. And at this point, I'm in the endpoint. And there's a few things to note here, is that once you're an endpoint, it gives you, of course, all of your information for your customers, your addresses, and there is no, that's something that's not available yet in this API, and we've put in a request, and it sounds like they're going to go and put it in, an address endpoint, and this is when you want to directly interact with an address inside of Spire for a given customer. That's where you need this. So it doesn't have that at the moment, but to learn the customer endpoints is a good way to start. So now, as you can see, when I'm in a customer endpoint, I have the delete button, the get button, and what this is, because they're using a third-party platform for doing the REST API, so it has this all inside of the application. So they just have to make sure. So Spire development just has to make sure that they go and now take the API and make it interact with the logic of Spire, and then give the ability where they will allow to do delete resources against a given endpoint, or get, or here in this case we can do a put. A put means you're updating it. So they make that available. So then you will see certain endpoints so here's the currency list that only has the get button. That means that you cannot interact with it other than just reading that information. There's no way for you to start posting. So here's the production order. So at the moment, you see that there is no delete or put button or the option to put, meaning that we cannot interact with it other than just reading that information and whatever we would do. But I know that they're expanding it. There's other endpoints that they've already added for editing. So AR, AP, all of those, I'm sure they will only take time, then they will come. So with the customer, we can, and here's just here I'm going to do a very simple, just go and do a put and update something. So I'm going to take customer A1948, and I'll show you that customer here. This is Inspire on the server that I'm connecting to. And just move this to the side. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to go and update this record. I'm going to update it to something. So here, just for testing purpose and playing around, just use the actual interface that Spire has provided. So take and copy. You don't need to copy everything. You can just copy whichever data you want, whichever rows or fields you want to update. but I'm going to take and copy this all. I'm going to go and paste it into here. Now I'm going to go and scroll up, and I'm going to do a few simple things here. I'm just going to say A1 Party Pleasers. That's the current company name. And then I'm going to say company. I'll just add the word company to the end. And another thing, I'm going to go and change the first address, or the ship to address. Here in this case, it's blank, which means it's the bill to address because we don't have an ID with that. So here I'm going to go and change the address to 1,500. And let's see, what else can I change here? Let's change their credit type, balance. This you wouldn't do because the balance would be calculated based on their AR outstanding, but let's update that. Let's update it to $100. And I haven't tried this one specifically. Some of them didn't work. We already reported a number of them that didn't work, and they have gone and fixed them already. So what I've done, I've just taken this data, and this is doing an application JSON. So I put this is the JSON format. So when you're looking at XML, it's a little bit easier to read and understand, but this is the JSON format. So exactly what you're copying here. I'm going to go and do a put with this information. So it's done. You see now here when it did a response, I got this back. So it updated this to company. Now let's just briefly go and look in Spire. I will actually close this record and reopen it. See here, actually the name already changed in the, oops, now somehow I turn on my camera. There. So you can see now, see company, and let's look for, see I updated the address from 555 to 0, so it's updated here. Let's see, where is the accounts receivable? Does it tell us what's outstanding? I did update that amount. Total balance, so that's coming from accounts receivables. I'm not sure where that field is that I updated. Okay, won't look for it. I know it's here somewhere, so I have to just find that field where I actually updated. But as you can see, I updated the address and I updated the company name, and both of those updated. So now there's a few things, and again, this is already further into the technicality. So a few things here that have happened is that if you update a resource, an endpoint, they're called endpoints. So first, references, that's the customer, like this. This is now the reference to a given endpoint, and I'm just going to go back. And here, oh, now it's asking me to confirm. Oh, I should not have done that. That's because I made some changes. Okay, so this is the endpoint. So what I just did here, when I copy and pasted this and did an update here on this data, I was interacting with the endpoint. Now an endpoint, when you interact with it and you want to confirm that, did it actually update? So for example, one example would be when you would interact with an application. I'll use an example here for our Magento development with our integration to Spire that we are doing. Here's an example, a response example. And for us, it would be something like, what we do, we sync customers both ways. So for us, it would be something like if a customer online and goes and adds a new address to their profile. So let's say the customer has it open. We have some customers that don't allow that and some do. So let's say a customer adds a new address online. And what we are doing is we are pushing that address to Spire right away. The minute so one of the benefits and one of the very nice things about the API is that you get immediate responses. So when somebody will click the button, save the address with the PHP example that I am using here, the minute the customer clicks the save button, that address is immediately exists in Spire. That's how, like, it's literally real time. Think about REST API as real time interaction with your data. So we can interact from Magento by, if a customer adds an address, we can, the minute the customer saves the address, that address now exists in Spire. That's how fast it is. And what it is when you interact with that data is that you get a response back. You get a response back saying what happened with what you just did. So here in this case, I got a response back 200 OK. Same thing here. You see that 200 OK. So in this case, I got an OK response. And the different responses, I'll show you a website here where I just found it. Different responses can be this. These are pretty much the standard. So 200 is an OK. 400 is a bad request. So if you get it back, 403 is forbidden. This would generally mean that you didn't have authorization to interact with that data. Once you're in Spire and you have yourself authenticated, here in this file, I'll show you briefly. Actually, no, I'll go and open this from here. This is one of our sample files that we've done. And let me open this here. Yes. So here's the sample file that we've actually done with PHP. This would be like from updating something from Magento. And you see that here we have the username and password and the URL, and here's all the specification, which endpoint we're updating and so forth. So this itself has the authentication in here, and keep in mind that this authentication is in here, but it is being transmitted via HTTPS SSL. So you're not exposing that as a readable or as a where somebody could interact like without security. So keep that in mind. So here in this case, this is the file, and then when I go back to my browser here, this is my response when I made an update on that resource. So now my resource, it has the status, what happened. So 500 is internal server error, 405 method not allowed. So you could be doing a put or delete. So let's say on a different table where they don't have updates enabled, it would give you this error saying that you're not allowed to. Okay, wait. I know that my desktop sharing paused here. What happened? There we go. Okay, so somebody was already letting me know. I saw that here. Okay, think you should see my desktop again. So here you have the codes, the response codes that you can get from the Spire Magento when you interact with it, or any other application that has REST API. And again, just in case for those of you who didn't see it, sharing seems to be a bit cumbersome. Here in the Spire API, when I did that interaction with changing the company name and the address, my response was okay. So that meant that it did update it. So again, a few things. It's real time. You can interact with the data real time, like I said, in an example of where you have a web application, and our example is customer comes and adds an address. The minute the customer clicks the save button, it immediately invokes our sample code. It invokes that code, and the minute the save button is clicked, the address is updated in Spire. So real time. That's the big advantage of the REST API. I briefly mentioned a SOAP API that used to be a previous standard, still being used and has its benefits too. There's both benefits, pros and cons on both, but Spire API is REST API is, of course, dominating everything. But there's immediate interaction. So again, back to the example of Facebook. If you use another service and you said you will log into that service with your Facebook username, that does a REST API call to the Facebook service, and then you get this pop-up and says from Facebook, and Facebook says, do you want to authorize this service or this company to use your authentication from Facebook? And you say yes, that exchange is made. And so that's real time. The minute you click on it, it's real time. That's the huge advantage here. And again, the older API methods, SOAP being one of them, they are not. There's some level of real time, but not nearly as sophisticated than the REST API. So I've shown you guys quite a bit here and what it all does. Go back to my presentation. So excellent performance, real time, as long as, so here too, again, going back to network configurations, if your customer did use the REST API, or you're developing something for the REST API for them, they would, of course, need a really good internet connection for this all to work well, a reliable internet connection, excellent firewall, sophisticated firewall, and they would need a dedicated IP address. So this case is where you need a dedicated IP address, and you wouldn't even want to start with any type of like DNS services in between. So you didn't have to have a static IP address. That just wouldn't be reliable enough. So dedicated IP address, that's a must here for working with the REST API. Again, if you're just doing some form of application that's internal, just for the users to internally interact with something outside of Spire, then no, there's no need and no worry about network security. But if you're doing anything outside, you do need a dedicated IP address. Simplicity of the interface. So you saw what I just did, and the concept behind all of this is really simple. Again, you learn the REST API for one application, and you will know now how to develop for other applications, because they're all the interface, the architecture behind it. It's all the same. You understand one, you understand all. So you'll learn much more As you learn the Spire API, you'll learn much more about what the capabilities are for Spire and for other applications. And so then as you develop and as you learn, you'll become very proficient in integrating to all kinds of applications. So basically, the sky is the limit in terms of what you can do. And so I'll briefly just show here what we are working on, and then I'll open it to questions. So I briefly mentioned Magento and how we're interacting with that. So we are working on in the e-commerce, the Magento. We are going live with our first Spire customer in October. So that is virtually done, except for adding some things and still testing. So that's what we're working on. It's one of them. And then we are developing a mobile app for Spire. So it will be compatible with iPhones, Android devices, Windows devices, and BlackBerry. Now BlackBerry being one of the companies that's actually also going to have a phone out soon with an Android operating system. That's the direction they're going. So it seems like BlackBerry itself with their own OS, they won't be around forever. So that's what we are working on. In the Magento link to Spire, we are using the SOAP API in one section of the application, just because it has some benefits that the REST API does not offer. But for the most part, we're using the REST API of Spire. And for our mobile app development, we are only using the REST API. That's all we're using there. We're not doing any type of other integration between that. So basically, you'll be able to take Spire everywhere you go. That's our slogan. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Okay, so somebody said my screen wasn't updating. I hope that wasn't for too long. So hopefully you guys still saw everything. So feel free to type your question in the chat window. And what I am going to do here is I'm going to give the option to unmute yourself. So I will make it available so you can unmute yourself.
No.
Okay, so I've set it now. I've muted everyone, and I've set it now so that you can unmute yourself. So for those of you who may want to ask a question using your microphone, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, and also in the chat window. So type in your questions, and I can take some questions. And anyone? Too much information? Not enough? I guess no questions. I don't see any questions coming in so far. Okay, let's see. Okay, the first question. Is SSL authentication required in cases where there will be no interaction with Spire from the public internet? So I briefly talked about the authentication. So SSL is just a protocol to transfer your communication, to communicate with the application in a secure way, same as a bank. So you go into your bank and you start interacting with your bank information. So you'll always see that it's HTTPS, meaning that's through an SSL certificate. So that's separate from authentication. Authentication is where you actually have to enter the username and the password. And that's the basic authentication for the REST API. There's the Auth 2, the version 2, which is even more advanced in terms of how you interact with the application. So, and to your question, is SSL authentication required where there's no interaction with Spire from the public internet? Yes, it doesn't work. It doesn't work any other way. So I'll just show you here. So here I'm interacting with my local server. Let me go here. See here, I'm interacting with my a local server locally. I'm not doing it over the public internet. Here I'm doing it. It's the same data. I just have it open, publish, blocked by IP address. So you see that by default, it's HTTPS. And we have that X here, and that's because it's a self-sign certificate. And let's click on this here a little bit. So self-signed certificate here basically says that the identity of the website cannot be verified, and that is because it's a self-signed certificate. So you are warned when you go with Chrome or Firefox or any browser, you're warned that this is not a secure website, and then you can say, yeah, I want to proceed. I know what I'm doing. So it's a self-signed certificate, and that certificate is available so for those of you who develop, this was one of our things that we had to figure out at first. It took us a little bit of time with Spire to figure it out. So in the C drive, and then let's go Spire server. Let's go here. And I believe in the server, where is it here? Here. This is the certificate. This is the SL certificate from Spire. So if you develop and you are wanting to authenticate on the application, even internally, so if it's not through the internet, in your application that you're going to be developing, you need to either, for number one, you need to buy a certificate, say from a source like GoDaddy and whatnot, and then there's no problem with you interacting with the API. But if you're developing and you're wanting to connect to Spire, you will have to take this certificate and specify that in your code when you develop, so that you'll be able to interact with the data. So here, I'll just show you a brief example. In this file here, so here we have specified, where is that part here? Now I'm gonna have to find it here in this code here in the bottom somewhere. We've specified the certificate. So we took the certificate and added to our server on the, say in our case, the Magento side, and then we can authenticate with Spire because now we have the certificate installed. If you're not going to be doing that, you won't get anywhere. So that's just already something to keep in mind, that if you don't get that covered right up front and you want to interact with the Spire API outside of the Spire interface, you won't get anywhere if you don't deal with the SSL certificate issue up front. That was one of the things that we had to learn at first, and took us a couple days, and with some help from support from Spire, and then we knew what to do and where the certificate is stored. So SSL is one thing, and yes, you can't without, because the Spire API, that's just what it is, and that's exactly how they're going to make it more secure. That will be one method. They'll probably use other methods to make it more secure, because right now, again, it's not hardened for already publishing it to the internet, accessing it, unless you do what we are doing, where we are blocking it by IP address, so then you can limit it from where it will be accessed. So unless you're doing that, then yes. But the first thing you're going to want to deal with is the SSL certificate, and then the authentication. That's just the username and password. Is the presentation being recorded? Yes, the presentation, I've recorded the presentation, so there was no screen sharing for the first little part, and I did that over again, so that will be part of it. But yes, it's recorded. And what I will do for all of those who signed up, and for those who verified via email that they were attending, I think I saw a few individuals here that didn't confirm. I will be sending out a link to the recording, and we'll include a few of the links for resources and stuff for you guys to get started. But yes, it is being recorded. Any other questions? Anyone? Well, if no more questions, then I think I'll end the meeting. And anyone interested or wanting to learn more one-on-one, if you have just a little bit of help here and there, I would be happy to interact with you in one-on-one. So when it comes to develop and really getting into it, then of course you want to learn it, you want to use it. But if you just need help here and there, just shoot a question. I'll get my developer involved. I am not the one that writes code. So this file here, I obviously didn't do it. I'm not a code person, but I have a good understanding once something is working or what it does. Once I understand what it does, and then I can basically go to the developer and say, okay, so here is what the possibilities are, and this is what I want done. So then I let them take over. So if you have any basic questions for anything, feel free to just send an email, and we'll help you along. Love to just help everyone along to get everyone going on Spire and keep the excitement, the momentum going. No more questions. So, okay, I will be ending the call, and someone said thank you. You're very welcome. And again, feel free to contact us if you want some help in getting going. Good afternoon to everyone.